It's amazing how fast the 6 months have actually gone. As the time is moving on. And tonight we welcome Des to the last talk. And as everybody knows, Des is no stranger to the Tipperary People and Places lecture series. He is an annual visitor, and we are delighted to have him, and we consider ourselves very, very lucky to have such an eminent historian in our midst, and who is so helpful to Tipperary libraries at all times. And as we all know, Des is a very, very busy man between visits to the National Library, his involvement in local radio, his publications, the Tipperary Historical Journal, and also business places like Clonmel and White, and many other places to give lectures. So on your behalf, I would like to welcome Des, and I'm sure we can look forward to a great lecture and a very enjoyable evening.
Thank you everyone to what's kind of become our annual get-together at this stage. When I was putting together a flyer for this talk, I was very careful about the title, that it is Aspects of Peerage, because it's a pretty huge topic, so obviously not everything is going to be covered, but I have written about 40,000 words on the topic, which I suppose eventually will be published in the Tipperary Historical Journal, the editor willing. So this really is kind of a distillation of what those articles would be. And looking over the notes, I kind of came to the conclusion that what I have here is probably more Blue magazine than it is Farmer's Journal. That's it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm always interested, with respect to other people, what prompts them to research something. And with regard to this topic, obviously, doing stuff on Tipperary history over the years, it's very difficult to avoid bumping into all this, that, and the other in various contexts. But I don't think the peerage as a specific topic in terms of the impact of the county has been looked at. And what prompted me to look at it, two specific things that kind of, as is the case, came together, one on top of the other really. I was in York, which is not a place I had visited before, obviously while I was visiting, and I was doing the usual tourist thing, looking at the interesting buildings, and particularly the ones that had blue plaques, and suddenly Emily jumped out at me. Now, I hasten to say that not a person, but Emily the place. I mean, York's interesting, but it's not that interesting. But I didn't expect to see Emily in York, and it turns out, of course, that it was a chap called Viscount Fairfax of Emily, and rather puzzled me because I have reasonable knowledge of Emily and its history, but that's not something I had come across in relation to Emily. But doing into digging, I discovered, of course, the Fairfax family is a Yorkshire family. It's a house in York. And Thomas Fairfax died in 1636, had accumulated enough money to buy a title. And the stewards, particularly the first two of them, were pretty good at selling titles as a way of raising money. So to have himself named after Emily, he paid £1,000, which was a huge amount of money then. No land in Emily, had nothing to do with Emily. Obviously the title passed on to his descendants, which is one of the reasons to get a title. But it became extinct in 1772, but it survived through 1 to 9 viscounts. And then you think that might be the end of Emily in terms of being used as a title, but of course it surfaces again. In the following century, a Liberal politician called William Onslow died in 1894. When the Liberal Party, Nashville and that, decided it was time to kick him upstairs, which was a way of getting him out of their way, and putting him into the House of Lords, he had to pick a title, and he picked the title, so he became Baron Emily. So it's the second time that Emily had been used as a title. Two families, nothing whatever to do with each other, and for two very different reasons. All of which kind of illustrates just how kind of interesting and complicated the whole business of the peerage is. So that business in York and Emily was one reason, and then a short time afterwards I was reading something, and again I would think at this stage I had a reasonable knowledge of Tipperary history, and as I say I was reading something, and suddenly I saw a reference to the Earl of Tipperary, which kind of threw me because it was something I hadn't come across before. One would expect that if there was going to be an title. Of course, it wasn't. So who the hell was the Earl of Tipperary? And who had the cheek to assume that title? Well, one of the younger sons of George III, you know, the Magnus of, etc. And he had a pretty large family. Adolphus Frederick, 1801, and must have been to the great joy of the Scots, he took several titles. And if you're au fait with the present royal family, you'll know the Prince of Wales has a whole series of titles, which explains why his wife is not the Princess of Wales, but the Duchess of Cornwall. So he had a variety of titles. One of them was the Baron of Culloden, which must have pleased the Scots no end. And then that's a Scots title, so he needed to have an Irish one, so he picked Tipperary. Why, I don't know. It was available, that is the Premier County. And then, of course, he had a dukedom, and that was the Duke of Cambridge. When he died, the title passed to his son. So there were just two generations of that family. The son didn't have a family. So you had an Earl of Tipperary between 1801 and 1904. Who knew? And because obviously it was one of their royal titles, it wasn't a title that was used, so it was quite easy to kind of keep it hidden. Business of getting a peerage is very much about human vanity and frailty, and won't come as a surprise to know that very often the impetus came from the wife. It had a lot to do with social distinction. The example of that appeals to me most has to do with the Agar family. In February 1805, the wife of the Archbishop of Dublin, who had previously been the Archbishop of Cashel, he had been promoted, obviously, Dublin was much more desirable than Cashel. And she wrote to an important government official in Dublin Castle, because, of course, while the Crown theoretically is the font of honours, basically it's a government decision. Well, she had a favour to ask. And she wanted nothing for herself or her husband. That had to be stressed up front. Obviously, as a churchman, as the Archbishop of Dublin, he was above such earthly vanities. But she did want something for her eldest son, who was then 27, and he was on his grand tour on the continent. And she wanted a promotion already. Her husband had a title, but she wanted a better title. Because there is this practice whereby, if you have a series of titles, a son, the heir, can use one of the subsidiary titles. So, as the son was on his grand tour, she realised that he would be treated better if she had a title for him. So she wanted promotion for her husband so that her son could use the subsidiary title. And the thing about the peerage is, of course, they're looked at from outside, which is, I assume, how all of us are looking at it, unless there are any of you here who have been. But one assumes that a lord is a lord is a lord. But of course that isn't the case at all. And it's probably, insofar as you come to these things to learn anything, you come here not knowing much about this, it's probably one thing you take away with you. That there's a very, very definite pecking order within this. And it won't come as a surprise to know that an English peerage is infinitely superior to an Irish one, which is one of the things we'll see. Anyway, Charles Agar, when he was in Cashel, because of his service to the government, not the church, he became a baron in 1795, he became a viscount in 1800, and then the letter his wife wrote us 5 years later. Obviously, the decision was that 5 years was kind of a decent interval to wait before he started begging again. And eventually, of course, he got his title and becomes Earl of Normanton. And anybody here from around Emily, that's where they owned a lot of their land which originally, of course, had been church land. It's not an accident that he was Archbishop of Cashel. But when he left, he kind of incidentally, accidentally took some of the church land with him. That's as I say, it's a story. And this is about having a title, being the Earl of this or something, isn't of itself something that gave you power. I mean, power was a matter of office and or land. But very often having the title is an indication that you had one or other of those things. As I say, it's theoretically the crown, but it realistically comes from the government. The aspect of this that most people know is, of course, how the Act of Union was passed, and the kind of bribery. And in terms of Tipperary titles, as I say, it illustrates the point that it is a mechanism used by the government, particularly in the 18th century, to get their way in terms of their policy. So, if you like, this is the litany of fame or infamy, depending on your politics. Frederick Trench was made Baron Ashtown, he was all to pass the Act of Union. Henry Pretty became Lord Denali, Baron Denali. John Toller became Baron Norbury. Viscount Dunmore became Earl of that case, he already had a title, but he gets a promotion. Barry Upton, the Baron Avonmore in 1795 was created Viscount to get another promotion. And Charles Agar was promoted from Baron to Viscount. So you had some people getting a step onto the peerage and others getting promotion within it, but it's all to the same point. One could look at the peerage, I suppose, kind of as a sociological or anthropological kind of phenomenon. It has characteristics, an indication of the measure of success for your family vis-a-vis other families. Healy Hutchinson, for example, and that's a family in terms of the Donimore title, they did quite well. They ended up with 4 distinct titles. 1794, for example, he looking askance at the Matthews, another family. The Matthews were much longer established, and that, of course, very much matters. And at that stage, the Matthews already had their title, and he was a Viscount. And so Healy Hutchinson was looking at this and counting out the advantages that the Matthews had got. But the head of the family was a Viscount, one of his sons was a Lieutenant Colonel, another son was a Major. I mean, again, indications of how successful you are with your nose in the trough patronage. And that was, Healy Hutchinson did very well in his own time. Because between the end of the 18th century, so many of these peers were made, there's wonderful people who were long-established peers, obviously, were looking down their noses at all these new creations. And there is a nice quotation from somebody: "I can hardly spit out of my coach without spitting on the Lord." An indication of what he thought about. One of the incentives, of course, for getting a title, I mean, there are several, but one is in terms of being able to pass it to your son and his son, and so on, the whole kind of primogeniture thing. Interestingly, looking at the peerage in Tipperary, the best laid plans, obviously, that's not something you can really plan for. So I don't know how this pans out in terms of other counties or how unusual it is, but some of the most significant ones they're planning in terms of their having a son to pass the title on, it didn't work out. Again, these are families you may be familiar with. The Damer family, for example, Lady Caroline Damer, her brother died in 1808, and she inherited it and wasn't married. So obviously when she died in 1829, that's the end of the Damer line and the Damer title. Matthews, again the same thing. Her brother died in 1833, Lady Elizabeth Matthew, and she dies in 1841. And as with both of those ladies, Caroline Damer and Elizabeth Matthew, there was great kind of discussion within the family and people looking from outside as to who is going to inherit. It's not at all inevitable. I'll come back to particularly the Matthew. In both of those cases, they're kind of interesting stories. The Matthew one is the one people know because part of the story that went around was that Father Theobald was theoretically in the running, which was never, of course, going to happen. But if you read stuff about Father Theobald, you may come across that. And the third example, of course, was the Care title, the Glencorp title. The last Earl died in 1858, only a daughter to succeed, Margaret Charter. She dies in 1915. The same thing happens with the O'Callaghan title, the Lismore title in Shannon. The last of those dies in 1898. He's 2 sons, but they predeceased him, so cousins inherit two ladies. So, as I say, those are some of the most significant land holdings, the most significant high-profile holders of titles, and their kind of long-term plans don't really work out. I mentioned about Lady Caroline Damer. As I say, her brother dies in 1808, she inherits, she doesn't marry, she dies in 1829. But there was obviously a male within the family who had the expectation of inheriting when Lady Caroline died. And there was a wonderful letter that was written by a mother to her son, and he was the chap who would be expecting to inherit when Lady Caroline died. Now this is 1808, Lady Caroline doesn't die until 1829, so he's hanging on quite a while. The warning is, I suppose everyone will be congratulating you on the supposed acquisition of a great fortune. But pray do not encourage such a notion, as I should be sorry it should come to Lady Caroline's ears, it being entirely in her option to give it to more remote cousins if she pleases. So it was a pretty astute warning by this chap's mother that he didn't want to count his chickens. Now, as it happens, he did inherit, but he waited until she died in 1829. And then, of course, it turns out that family would have been a damn sight better off had he not inherited, because he left enormous debts, and that will kind of come back to him. And similarly with regards to Matthew, I mean, she wanted to leave the family fortune within the Matthew family. Maybe father Peerage would have been an option, but she decides to go with these French relatives who are not on the Matthew side, they're on her mother's side. So I suppose at the end of the day, it's going to be people have that kind of discretion over their estates and where it's going to go. It's an Italian individual choice. Marriage, of course, is the other big issue here. If you're in that category, who you marry is going to be of some consequence. Most people who are peers, as distinguished from just mere landowners, tended to pretty much hunt farther afield than just marry locally. Probably not surprising. But on the other hand, if you're looking for a wife in England, coming with an Irish peerage is not a great asset. As I say, Irish peerage might think it's wonderful to be a lord, but there were lords, and then again there were lords. Again, an example that people are pretty familiar with in terms of an Irish peer managing to get a wife with money is the Richard Butler, the Elk and Gaul, who married a lady with a lot of money from a father who had made money in trade and commerce. I understand there are parts of London Dockland where you find Tipperary names from streets and so on because of that connection with William Mellish's, yes, Margaret Mellish, and that kind of saved the Butler family. So, in terms of TV drama and novels, you tended to find that with, obviously, a much bigger scale than later in the century, when kind of impecunious English peers looked for daughters of American millionaires to come and kind of save their family homes. It's very established, as I said, the stuff of drama and so on. But this is a kind of much smaller scale Irish example. As I mentioned, most peers didn't marry locally, whereas if you look at your kind of gentry families or local landowners, as often as not they did. So in the Donmore case, I mean, the first Earl is unmarried, the second Earl is unmarried, the third Earl has two wives, one Dublin, one Westmeath, the fourth Earl Monaghan, the fifth Earl is abroad. The only exception to this basically are the Donnellys up in Kilboy. The first Baron marries a local person, the Sadlers. The second Baron marries a Trant, then marries a Maud. The third Baron marries a O'Callaghan, and the fourth Baron goes to England. They're one example of people, family who are pretty local. Then Rowe, the Kerr family, England. First Earl is Cork, second Earl, England, the one I mentioned, the rich lady. The Mauds in Dundrum. The first Viscount has three goes, England, Ireland, so it's not local. The second Viscount marries the daughter of Charles Agag, the Archbishop, whom I mentioned at the beginning. The third marries in England, the fourth marries in England. The Lismores, the Shanley family down in Claheen. The first Baron marries the Speaker, the daughter of the Speaker of the House of Commons. First Viscount marries the daughter of the Earl of Ormond, which is Kilkenny, which is pretty close. The second Viscount marries somebody from England. And then the Matthews, the first Earl of Wicklow, the second Earl of Kildare. So, as I said, it's fairly obvious, I suppose, why it would be. If you have a title and you have the estates to go with it, you're likely to travel more, you're likely to meet more people, and you're likely to think that you're a better bargain. So you kind of look further abroad. As I say, getting a peerage doesn't just relate to the amount of land you have. The one big exception, if you were to equate it with having a large estate, which you should have a peerage to go with it, the Massey Dawsons of Ballincorty were among the largest landowners in the county, but weren't in the way of getting a title. I have no evidence that they ever even were looking for one, because don't think the titles came to you, you sat back and were bashful, you basically went out looking for one. It wasn't a guarantee you'd get it. A good time to get one was high days and holy days, which in terms of the royal family would be accessions. So to mark George IV's crowning in 1821, 22 peers were created. The one local example, the Earl of Donmore, was given an English peerage. As I say, one thing you're likely to take away from this, if you don't understand the system, is just how elaborate pecking order there was within it, so having an English peerage was downside better than having an Irish one. Victoria's big day in 1838 marked by 11 creations, and Viscount Lismore again was given a UK title to go with the Irish one, but was superior. Edward VII's coronation in 1902, the one local example of that, Arthur Houston in Barry, famous in Tipperary, was finally given his peerage. He became Baron Barrymore, which was a title that had been used by the Barons way back on that side of his family. And of course he had no surviving sons, so he was the one and only Baron Barrymore. It's interesting too to look at, to kind of analyse these families as to what their actual family backgrounds were. Not very many of them were of Gaelic origin, and basically just two that I could see that were really significant within the peerage in the county. The O'Callaghan's obviously came up Cork, and they became, took the Lismore title. And Meads were Earls of Clonwilliam, except they kind of cleared out of the county before the famine. They were here for a time. The Butlers, obviously very Old English. And there were lots of kind of related Butler titles, including the Munro title. The Fitzgibbons, similarly Old English, the Earls of Clare. Matthews would be kind of early 17th century, came over the Butlers. And then a lot of them, probably oldest for us to see, were Cromwellian families. The Pretties, the Moles, the Kings, the Damers, the Ponsonbys, the Moores, the Tollers, all of these, a lot of these. It may be that if you were to use genetics as an answer, that they were pretty kind of trusting families and that they had enough to get up and go to having got states in Ireland. There were also various generations going to get titles to go with. I mean, that's kind of has to do with genetics. I don't know how valid an argument it is, but a substantial number of them are from that. How did the system work? Easy to remember in the sense that it kind of goes with 5 and 5. You have 5 steps within the peerage and you have 5 separate peerages. So the 5 ranks really at the bottom, because as I said, it is very much a pecking order. At the bottom we have the title of Baron, which is the one they use nowadays for live peerages in England. And that's a more modern kind of creation. Henry Pretty was created Baron in Alley of Kilboy in July 1800. I mentioned that earlier, it was kind of happened to the Union now. He died a few months later. And obviously his son got the title, but they never advanced in the peerage. That was as high as they got. It didn't much matter because kind of colloquially it was lowered, you know, and we don't make that distinction, but if you're going to be kind of technical about it. The Baron's title, of course, goes way back. It is kind of, I suppose, comes with the Normans, the Norman Conquest, 1066 and so on. Kind of a phrase that sums the whole system up is, with regard to the peerage, is that long before it was social, the peerage was military, but it had always been economic. So, if you like, it kind of relates to social, military, and the economic aspects of the peerage. The next step after Baron is Viscount. And from the examples I cited earlier within the county, you can see that some never moved from the first rung, some then advanced to the second rung, which is Viscount. And basically Viscount is a kind of staging post on the way to being an Earl, which was the kind of realistically as high as you were likely to go unless you were somebody fairly exceptional. In a system that has 5 stages, number 3 is about as far as you could really aspire to. The O'Callaghan's, down in Shamrock, Taheen, whatever, they basically got to Viscount, and that was as far as they went. Cornelius O'Callaghan created Baron Lismore in 1785, and he became Baron Lismore of Shannon, which again means to me, once you get a peerage, what are you going to call yourself? And it's usually kind of territorially based, but that doesn't mean that you owned the place you were named after. In this case, I would assume because the O'Callaghans came out of Cork and there is a civil parish, I haven't gone into their history, but I'm kind of making an assumption that that's the Lismore connection, something to do with Waterford. Again, you find that the Matthews of Landaff, the original Matthew had come from Wales, and that was kind of for the family origin. Whether it did or not, when Maud Howard became Earl of Montalbot, again, they go back to their family history, but that's before they, obviously, they'd come from somewhere before they came to Ireland. So there's a degree of sentimentality, I suppose, about it. And then the third step, which is, as I say, as far as you could logically aspire to, which if you're fans of Downton Abbey, which is kind of the stage they're at, would which would be to become an earl, which is, again, it actually predates the Normans, so it's probably one of the oldest of the titles. And in terms of Tipperary history, these are the names that most resonate. So you have Donoughmore, Glengall, Clonmel, Bessborough, Landaff, Kingston, Portarlington, Normanton, Norbury, Ormond. In a kind of a superficial acquaintance, you're going to run into some of these names. And wasn't cheap, of course. I mean, apart from the degree to which you had to sell your soul in order to get a title. An interesting definition of an honest politician, and I hasten to say this is an historic definition, not a current one, is that an honest politician is somebody who once bought, stays bought. And in terms of these people getting their titles, as often as not, they stay bought. So, Healy Hutchinson, for example, would be a case in point. When he became an earl in 1800, the fees he had to pay was £629, which was again multiplied by 50 or 60. I mean, it's a lot of money. And then because he needed a technical thing in the title, so that because he wasn't married, his brother would succeed, he had to pay another £328. So it's £1,000, which is, again, I emphasise, because money things are always a problem, because it doesn't sound like very much, but in terms of, it's a huge amount. And then the final two ranks really are were in the stratosphere, Marquess and Duke. As far as the Marquess was concerned, because the butlers eventually, you got to the first Duke and the second Duke, and then they made a mistake politically, and they supported the Jacobites, and the second Duke had to flee. So a collateral branch of the family manages to get back into favour, and they're given the Marquess, so they don't quite get back into being Duke. But it's interesting that the second Duke of Ormond, who's the great figure in the restoration of Charles II, and he becomes Duke about 1660, and he's running the country, and he's a hugely important political figure. 20 years on, he's given an English dukedom, which is infinitely more significant than just being the earl, even though Duke is top of the heap. And normally dukes would be members of the royal family. So the English-Irish thing again kicks into place. So it's all really snakes and ladders. In the 19th century, there is two other dukes, but again, I'm talking about Tipperary County, and dukes are terribly verified creatures. And there are really only two who have anything to do with the county. Devonshires, who own Lismore in Waterford, but they still own Lismore Castle. People would associate them with Chatsworth, stately home in England and so on. But they owned a tiny amount of land in County Tipperary, which is residue from the old Boyle estate in the 16th century. And eventually they sold it on because the cost of administering it wouldn't have made any sense. An interesting technical thing about it is that the townlands they tended to own were spittle townlands. I mean, townlands with that name, so obviously related back to the Nazi spittlers, or anyway, they're slightly wrong. So they had one thing, and the only other duke then was the Duke of St. Albans, who again through marriage into the Osborne family at the end of the 19th century. I think they probably lived down in Marnane, which is outside Clonmel. But he was a duke, but I don't think he had the land and the wherewithal really to go with it. But in terms of an ordinary gentry family, which is what the Osbornes of Marnane were, and for one of them to end up marrying a duke was, even though he wasn't the richest of dukes, and that's dukedom that goes back to one of the offspring of Charles II, of whom there were many. So again, there are dukes and there are dukes, but he's still, I suppose, he's a duke. And then the other thing I mentioned is so those are the 5 grades, and it's only the bottom 3 that have anything to do with this county, really, which is probably true of most counties, I would guess. And then there are 5 separate peerages. And as I said, the one that's at really the bottom of the heap, as far as we're concerned, is the Irish one. The Irish peerage obviously operated from the beginning, which is when the Normans came, and the Earls of Ormond and the Earls of Carrick before that would have been one of the first creations, then the other Desmond. Titles were given out fairly sparingly in the earlier centuries, until you come to the Stuarts, and as I say, they start selling them. And the Irish titles finish with the Act of Union in 1801. So that's number 1. Then the second, you have English and Scottish titles. And obviously the English titles continue and the Scottish titles continue until the Act of Union between England and Scotland, which is roughly 100 years before the Irish one in 1707. And again, I assume, I don't know much about it, that having just purely a Scottish title was something that people would look down their noses at. Then you had British peerages between 1707 and 1800, and then after the Act of Union you had United Kingdom peerages. So they're quite separate. So if you know, somebody is a baron or an earl, it depends when the title is created, where they fit in. And so it's very much a kind of a pecking order. Interesting, easy way to illustrate that from my own part of the county. If you go back to certain dates in the early 19th century, you had two earls, one of whom owned Ballycastine Estate, which is Limerick Junction, on the border between Tip and Limerick, 7,000 acres. And that was owned by the Earl of Derby. And then over the road a bit, around Thomastown, you had that estate, and of course they had Thurles as well. And that's the Earl of Landaff. So looked at superficially, with two earls. And you might think, well, you know, there's not much to choose between them, but of course, you really can't compare them. And the Earls of Derby, they're an English title, and Richard III was in the news recently. They found his little story, found his bones in the car park. It seems so unlikely, but one of the reasons he lost the Battle of Bosworth was that the Stanley family kind of let him down at the last moment. Well, they, of course, were paid off, became Earls of Derby, and had their estate in Tipperary. So you have the 14th Earl of Derby, an English title that goes back to the late 15th century. Whereas then over the road you have the Earl of Landaff, but that's an Irish title, and the chap I'm looking at is only the second Earl, and it's a new title. So you're getting my point, I presume. They're both Earls, but there really isn't any connection. I came across a wonderful description of that, which kind of totally encapsulated the reality of how different they are. It was a biography I was reading of Robert Walpole, kind of first British Prime Minister. And when George II came over to England, he brought his mistress with him, as one does. And she was German, and of course she got various spoils and had to get various titles. And so they offered to make her Duchess of Munster. That's our Munster, not the German. And she thought, well, this wasn't bad, but then she realised it was an Irish title, even though it was just the Duchess. The chap who wrote the book that I'm referring to, a wonderful way of describing that, he said it was like expecting to get a Burberry and being offered a plastic Mac. And the conference was just what the reality is. Getting a peerage, primarily, again, I'm looking at examples in Tipperary, but it would be true of the country, it was a reward for service to the government of the day, particularly at the end of the 18th century. And that, for the most part, means legal service. I mean, the title of this talk, and the article I've written is for services rendered, and, you know, I say cover a multitude, but for the most part, the services are legal. And so you have a list. If I was organised differently, I'd have my PowerPoint, but I have a kind of version of PowerPoint, so that's why it's not there. So you just have to bear with me. You have the Avonmore title, and that was created for Barry Elverton, died 1805, legally created as Attorney General, Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, and then he becomes a Baron, he becomes a Viscount. Family down on Clonmel, Carlton, Lord Chief Justice, the Court of Common Pleas, becomes the Baron and the Viscount. These are all late 18th century, but it's all for legal services. And if you're reading Irish history from that period, from a nationalist slant, you'll come across these people adopting the role of villain. Doesn't mean they necessarily were. In the end, you're likely to come at them. And John Fitzgibbon, Lord Chancellor of Ireland in 1789, becomes Baron, becomes Viscount, becomes Earl, and then he gets a fourth title because he becomes Baron in Great Britain. He gets a British title, so he picks up four. And John Scott, Lord Chief Justice, the Court of King's Bench, becomes a Baron, Viscount, and an Earl. These are all around the same period. So in terms of creation of titles, this is the greatest period. The Donmores pick up 5 or 6 titles because they managed, in 1 or 2 cases, to get a title for one of their wives separately, which is quite again, a different thing. And John Toller, the Norbury title, again, we usually adopts the role of villain. And the Normanton, when I mentioned Water Park, again, he was Receiver General, not a name very well known. They had an estate in the county. After 1801, of course, I mean, before the Act of Union, having a title had a seat in the Irish House of Lords in College Green, but once that was abolished, the British certainly did not want their House of Lords inundated by all these ridiculous, weird Irish peers. So the way they got around that was they said, right, we'll have 28 of them. And so how did you pick what 28 would you go for? So you had an election. And once you were chosen as a representative peer, you had a seat for life. That's the system they used. But there was an election. So in 1833, for example, Lord Lismore, chap down in Shamble, he had a go. Fancied himself having a seat in the House of Lords, but he was defeated. And the winner got 76 votes, he got 27. One of the reasons, of course, he didn't get there was because he had marital difficulties, which I'll come to. You could see why he would want to be having a seat in the House of Lords when it happened. He won in London, obviously, apart from the social aspect of it, you were having a role in the running of the government. I mentioned Hello magazine at the beginning, and that this was more hello than this is, or I'm coming to the hello bit really, because one of the prices you paid if you had peerage is that, of course, the newspapers, periodicals that they paid attention to, particularly if something went wrong. And I mean, that's not new. I mean, these were the celebrities and the VIPs of their day. And there are lots of instances I could pick out, but just for your delectation, very briefly, 5 kind of scandals. This is literally wake up. It's interesting. So, press intrusion isn't really anything. In fact, if you go back to the late 18th, early 19th century, the press was much more, I mean, they're bad today, but they were much more vicious. And that's before the Victorians knew kind of kicked in. I mentioned about the Damers, and Lady Caroline Damer, and the letter from the mother to the son, he shouldn't count his chickens. Well, he might as well have counted, because he did inherit when she died in 1829, but he was totally useless. Now, he died unmarried at the age of 64, one might say in kind of shady circumstances, shady lady, in 1845. Before that, lots of court cases looking for maintenance, standard story. But nothing unusual. Human nature is human nature. But because you're an earl, all of this is going to get much more notice when it comes into the courts. The case, this is Leash, it's their emo. Mary Fitzgerald, a handsome girl, the press called her, claimed she had a child by him in January 1826. And 3 days after her delivery, she and her mother met the girl by appointment. That he made various promises, mainly financial, which he didn't keep. And then you might think she had learned her lesson, but a year or so later she had another child by him. And the same thing happens again, and so there's endless court cases looking, and she's not the only one. So there's lots of maintenance, but he's an error, so the press pays attention. Second example has to do with the Matthews in Thomastown. Francis James Matthews, the second Earl. And he gets caught up in what is probably the great scandal of the great scandal of the 19th century, certainly the early 19th century, the whole business of George IV and his wife, Queen Caroline, whom he couldn't abide, and when he was going to be crowned, she was basically at the door of Westminster knocking everybody in. It became huge. So there was a public inquiry, he wanted the whole. But anyway, the Matthews became caught up with that because they were part of that kind of set. So in the summer of 1820, there was a public inquiry into Queen Caroline's history. And obviously, and opinion in Britain is totally divided, and you had a lot of people taking the Queen's side. And the press, of course, had an absolutely wonderful time. One of the people who called to give evidence on behalf of the Queen was Matthew Landau. And he told them that around 1815, he and his wife were in Italy, mainly in Naples, which is enough to arouse some suspicion. And for several years, they were frequently in the company of the princess as she then was. So she was married to the Prince Regent. When he was to become king, she thought she should become queen, so it was a whole blue. And so the argument of the king was that, of course, she wasn't behaving herself when she was in Italy, and that there were grounds for a divorce. So this is what the inquiry was about. the Earl was kind of giving evidence in her favour. And he emphasised that at all times he never saw any impropriety in the conduct, anything in the demeanour or manner of the Princess that made it unpleasant to be associated with her. And the big scandal that was associated with her, there was a chap that she was kind of with, who was supposed to be her butler, but was actually her gentleman friend. And so when that was asked about him, he casually declared that in Italy, there was nothing unusual about men visiting ladies in their bedchamber in the morning. Not in Knightsbridge. So the whole inquiry, as you can imagine, you'll have to look up for yourself, is this kind of tittle. But the Matthews get dragged into it now, because they're testifying for her side, and he wins, and he, after all, is the king. It's not doing them any favours in terms of their prospects. The third example then is kind of the worst, because it's really not playing the game, it's divorce. And Cornelius O'Callaghan, the first Viscount of Lismore, married in 1808 when he was 33. Again, the press had an absolutely glorious time over this. And the match seemed very suitable because he married Eleanor Butler, 21, youngest daughter of the Earl of Ormond, so it seemed to become a very suitable match. And she gave him 3 sons and a daughter, so far so good. But they separated in 1819 and divorced in 1826, and of course, as you know, divorce was a very difficult thing in Parliament and all the rest of it. And this wonderful phrase, and I think it's my favourite euphemism, criminal conversation, which is what we've been accused of. Lismore's side emphasised when, again, the divorce at the beginning was heard, he emphasised how fairly he had treated her, and that he had raised her allowance to £2,500 per annum, which would have been part of the marriage settlement, but anyway. And then on her side, lots of sulks. She was explaining that she wasn't happy because he wouldn't take her on the continent. He wanted to stay at home in Tahine. So Paris or Tahine. And it emerged during the proceedings that she had, of course, and this is another matter, she conducted a long affair, again Naples, that seemed to be the place to go, with the Honourable Richard Bingham. And of course, he's the younger brother of the famous Lord Lucan of the Crimean War. Really was involved in. So that's that. They were also in the news because they still had ground rents above in Westport or something, and they still have. That was a fairly recent story, but it's the same family. And he was a lot younger than her, so this was toy boy, I suppose is our term. And again, the servants. Servants are wonderful in this, because they were always called to give evidence. And so one witness in the divorce proceedings, at this stage they were in Verona, up north. And that Bingham desired me to bring in some medicine. This is the servant's story. And I found him in bed with her, which is, while Lismore got his divorce, not a lot of sympathy for him, he was giving damages of 1 shilling. You can see whose side, so he's obviously a boring chap. And Pierre Countess remains in Italy with her chap, and dies in Sorrento in 1859, which is many years afterwards. Presumably all passion spent for that stage. And Viscount dies 2 years later. But as I say, because they're who they are, and that whole thing is not helpful in terms of whatever ambitions you might have, politically or otherwise. Fourth example, the 1860s, this was huge. We're moving on further, but again, the press coverage, this particular one has to do with Viscount Avonmore. They had an estate around Ross Gray. Not a very big estate, but they had a house in an estate there. Simon Sharma, who does television stuff, his daughter has written a book on this. So if this particular one catches your fancy, it's all there. There's a copy of it in the library here. Anyway, William Charles Yelverton, which is the family name, is an army officer and a younger son, but he eventually gets the title. He meets Teresa Longworth, who's something of a bohemian, in 1852, and a relationship develops between them. And basically, there's a kind of that at cross purposes. He wants a mistress, she wants a husband. So they will be some messages there. But to keep her happy, he goes through 2 kind of fake marriages. Catholic marriages, one with an unfortunate priest over in the west of Ireland who seems to be very besotted, because you think in terms of going to marriage, there would be a lot of formalities to be gone through to exactly avoid this kind of thing. But anyway, he does. So as far as she's concerned, she's married to this chap. He then inherits the title. And because in their relationship, they're actually apart a lot of the time. she opens a newspaper one day and reads about his wedding, because he's just got married, and legitimately, so she's not best pleased. So the whole thing is ironed out in 4 courts in 1861. And again, if you look at press reports, Dublin is thronged because the good old Dublin public take her to their hearts, and so she's the heroine of the... But, I mean, she doesn't, as far as the courts are concerned, and it goes through a lot of court stuff, his marriage to her is seen as being vigorous, or sorry, that it didn't take place, even though she went through 2 forms of marriage, one in Ireland, one in Scotland. So it's a huge issue. He eventually becomes the 4th Viscount, dies in 1870. Now, it didn't have any effect on his career, because he doesn't seem to have been a chap that was up too much. Even in his military career, he wasn't going anywhere. But the press wouldn't have paid anything like the attention. This was a huge case in its day. And then the last one, again slightly different, has to do with the Earl of Orkney. They had estates around Thurles, in fact. They had a lot of land, and still had it until the early 20th century. A lot of land. What happened in that case? The heir to the title married in 1802, dies in 1820, leaving 2 sons, and eventually the sons grew up separated from their mother, and there was a war, a vicious war between the sons and their mother in this case. And part of the row, as is always the case, is over her settlement, what she's entitled to from the property. And this was money to be paid out of the Thurles lands, because in marriage settlements, not only would the amount be specified that she used to get when a widow, but from what land rental was to be taken. So that's how it's kind of a local relevance. So, I mean, again, it's quite a lot of money, it's 1,200, and I love she was, apart from that, she had 550, which was including her pin money, so it was kind of a miscellaneous spending. And eventually the sons have her declared insane, and she's locked up, and it becomes a huge kind of cause célèbre, and all very nasty, because it's sons against their mother. Again, the press had an absolute field day. Now, in all of this, of course, what matters is land, and the ownership of land. Famously, Winston Churchill, who at the end of the Second World War, when Gallows was offered a dukedom for what he had done, he made a hell of the reasons, but one of the reasons he apparently turned it down is he didn't have the land that would kind of support dukedom, because you're talking about an enormous amount of land. I mentioned about the Derby estate, the Ballycastine estate, and Lord Derby, who was the owner of the estate, though it was shortly to be sold, he was the person who was responsible for this famous, I say famous, since we ever done anything on this, a source you come across as this reckoning of who owned what from 1876, which is the main listing you would go to, for how much land the individuals owned. And because there had been criticism about the amount of land peers and other people owned, and he said no, they don't have the huge assets they're accused of having. And because nobody had actually examined the thing, said, right, we set up an investigation. And so this was the report in 1876. Now, it's one of these things that probably backfired, because, of course, when it's reported, it transpired to be true, what people suspected to be true, that the peers had an enormous amount of land, not just obviously in Ireland, but throughout the United Kingdom. So in a sense it backfired. In terms of Tipperary, people with titles owned about 20% of the county. And that's the 1876 figure, so it's about 200,000 acres. So that's the scale of what you're talking about. If you look at the kind of the specifics, well, there are 2 ways of measuring it in terms of kind of who's who, in terms of peerage in the county. Apart from, one of the things we can't measure is individual worth, so in terms of personality or character. So we're left with what people owned. And there are 2 measurements there. You go with the amount of acres somebody had, probably more validly what the valuation was, because you could have a lot of acres, you might be the side of a mountain, so while on paper it would be impressive. So if you look at it in terms of acres, at the top of the heap would be Lord Lismore and Clogheen, 35,000. This is the pecking order. Then Dunalley, 21,000. These are the key people in the county. Number 3 then is somebody who hasn't the title that I mentioned earlier, Master Dawson, but never seemed to have looked for one. I wasn't involved in earning one. Number 4 would be the Kerr family, at this stage Lady Margaret Chartres, 16,000. Then Lord Ormond and Kilkenny. Well, that's hardly surprising, because at one stage, the butlers have owned pretty much, not all the county, but they have massive hundreds of thousands of acres, so this is what was left. Dundrum, Howardin, 15, basically Kildamanna, Baron of Lower Kildamanna, is theirs. Then you've two interesting newcomers, because of course with the incumbent States Court House, the family, a lot of states were sold. And so these are, and again their names you might know, Nathaniel Buckley, who's the name is remembered in legalities for being nasty to people, and the other would be Arthur Moore in Moorsport, and that family is still there, but they're all post-famine. But all the rest, and then the other is Lord Clonmel, all the others are, so there is a match, if you like, between people with titles and people who are in terms of owning land. And if you look at it in terms of valuation, which is probably a more valid way of looking at it, Lismore is still on top. Even though a lot of the land is great, but it comes up. Butler is there, Howardin is there, Kilkenny, the Ormond are there, Denali. The two ones that come into the list then will be Smith Barry, and eventually they get the title, and then the other will be Carden and Templemore, because their valuation is quite high, obviously, because they're a lot of urban territory. If you have an estate, you obviously have a house, so then there's the question of who among these people were actually resident. And the fact that you had a residence didn't necessarily mean you were resident, but at least to have a residence for something. And what I could see, of 35 members of the peerage who had land in Tipperary, only 9 had residences in the county, so most of them elsewhere. And it doesn't mean that they were in England or in Naples. I mean, you know, they could have been had a home in certain surrounding counties, so quite near their state, but they're not actually in the county. Interesting example of why you might be in the county would be Lord Bloomfield. And there were 2 members of that family. They landed over on Newport, and they were in the diplomatic service. But the first Lord Bloomfield did intend coming back to live near Newport in East Estate, and just died just before the famine in 1837. And there's a chap who was travelling in that area, and in 1837, and his story as to why the family were no longer resident is that the second Lord Bloomfield, probably his father's death, had come back with his wife and family, intending to live. And that would be quite important in terms of the impact on the area, and it might be easier on the tenants to have the actual owner rather than an agent, because agents often had things to prove, which we didn't. Anyway, why they weren't resident, they were hardly back a few weeks. One morning, Bloomfield and his household were at prayer, and a man arrived at the door with a message, and insisted that the message be given to his lordship. And the messenger said that he was being watched from the gates by armed men, and that they had to witness the message actually being given to his lordship, which was all done. And the message was, of course, a threatening letter, quite common in those years, demanding that Bloomfield dismiss his agent, and again, quite common to reinforce the point. The letter was decorated with the usual crude drawing of the coffin and all the rest of it, and all kinds of usual warnings. And anyway, the point of this is that very afternoon, Lady Bloomfield ordered her carriage and left for England, and the rest of the family soon followed, and that was the end of their residence in the location, which was not an advantage because the state continued to be there. Margaret Chartist wasn't in care very much. Apparently she didn't much care for the crossing of the Irish Sea. So she was away more often when she was there. Viscount Howard in Dundrum Hall, whose wife was the famous photographer, more often in England than I think they were in Dundrum. And a wonderful quotation on this issue of residence. This relates to Lord Clonmel, and somebody from the Dublin Castle looking down their nose on this at Clonmel. It's true that he has bought land in Tipperary, but he seems to have done that on speculation, and evidently it does not mean to reside. For I cannot call it residence to be a few days every year at a hotel in Dublin and a few weeks at an agent's house. So it's a pretty good definition of, it's more than just having a house. And that brings me to the issue then of those who had a substantial house. And the term, of course, that we would use is, the big house, in a lot of literature of the period. And again, the pecking order there probably wouldn't come as a surprise. At the top of the heap, the highest valuation is Shanbally down in Tahin for Lord Lismore, and eventually that was 1940s, 1950s, was demolished and burned up, in spite of attempts to try and preserve it. So that's top of the heap. Care House would be next. Thomastown would be kind of third in the list. I don't suppose there's any surprise about these. Dundrum House, which is one of the only ones that I mentioned, is still there. Obviously, it's the hotel. Kilboy, that's there, but I think there was a fire where only some of it was rebuilt. And then Ryanair bought it, but it's not the house that was there originally. Knockloftty, that's still there. Valuation, it's in an odd siting, it's kind of down in the hollow, if I remember, so that might the valuation lower than we would expect. So the point is, I suppose, with regard to these peers, depending on how you want to define them, not very many of them were resident, that's the point. Again, you'd have to compare Tipperary with other counties, and I don't have those figures. You know, it was a situation in terms of actual residents, not pretend residents, greater or lesser than in other counties. Because it did make a difference, obviously, people as substantial and as important as that they were here. For those who were residents, they were expected to have a role in terms of local government. And one of the measurements of that, if you like, is this role of Lord Lieutenant. Now, you see that if you follow things in England, and you're interested in the doings of the royal family, you'll see when the Queen visits a new county that one of the people who's on hand, usually in a fancy uniform, is the Lord Lieutenant of the county. So that would be their version of it. But back in the 19th century, the role was created by 1830. There had been kind of earlier roles. And it's a kind of an indication, looking at various counties, as to what the government thinks in terms, because these people were invariably peers, what the pecking order would be. The first one that was picked, probably not, was the second Earl of Donegal. So when you looked at the peers in County Tipperary at that period, he was the one that kind of stood out. He died shortly after getting the office. But the third Earl then got the office and had it 30 years until 1851. But then that's a family that were very involved in public life, so not surprising. 1851 to 57, first Viscount Lismore, turned to the O'Callaghan's. Then the second Viscount, so obviously the whole divorce thing didn't do as much damage as you might have expected. And then probably he wasn't going to Ascot. Then the 1885 to 1905 Maud, and then the chap who unfortunately had it when there can't have been any picnic to have from 1905 to 1922 when the office ended, was the 4th Baron Marnane. So that's really a key indicator of who were the Lord Lieutenants. And so you have Donamore, 2 Donamores, 2 Lismores, 1 Maud and 1 Marnane. So that in terms of their personal impact is distinct from the importance. I mentioned the incumbent States Court, and really had a huge impact in bringing that whole system to an end. And when the articles I've done eventually, and then if you're interested in facts and figures, but the biggest estate obviously that was sold was Dawson Damer, the Earl of Portadown, which is the Damer inheritance. The second Earl, Lady Caroline's Damer's heir, wasn't married, died in 1845. 2 figures illustrate just how extraordinary the level, the income at that stage from their lands, and they had huge amounts, it was about 30,000, which was enormous. If you had that income in 1845, it was a huge income, because as I say, you multiply it by maybe 60, 70. But the debts, 700,000, and again, you multiply that by the same multiplier. Now, how they got to that level of debt, I mean, if you're gambling every day of the week, I don't know. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of debt. So all these estates, it's the biggest offloading of land really in the county. And so much land that has to be sold in about 10 different divisions. The biggest one is probably the 4th division, which impacts most on the county, thousands and thousands of acres. So that finishes their relationship. Obviously, the family, the second Earl was followed by his nephew. Family didn't have legitimate children, but they managed to hold on to Emo, so they still had a presence. And there is still, I think, an Earl of Portadown, as there is still an the Montalt, but obviously they've no contact anymore, I think, with Ireland. So huge amounts of land sold. Rossgrave was one of the divisions that was sold, so it wasn't all rural. So around 110,000 acres in Tipperary came to the market. So it's absolutely, and often it's underestimated in terms of the impact that had. Obviously, we would see it from the point of view of the tenants. It made a huge difference to have a new landowner. Point, I think my hour is up, so I want to finish. I mentioned at the beginning about the Earl of Normanton and his wife writing and looking for titles for her son. I think, given we were talking about peers and none of us is, it would probably be the right thing to give a peer the last word. So I'm not going to have the last word. Lady Normanton is going to have the last word. This is her actual extract from her letter when she's looking for it, and I like it very much. There is nothing that the Archbishop and I have that is so near at heart as the adorning of our dear son, now on his travels. We want him to be adorned with a little feather to make him more presentable wherever he goes. On the continent, rank is inestimable, and even at home it's no small addition to a young man who, in our partiality, we think wants nothing to recommend him, having the advantage of the best education, the first alliance, and possessing all good fortune. So we will be very pleased to make his father an Earl. And what I really like about that, if you know your Jane Austen and know your Pride and Prejudice, that's the voice of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Thank you very much.